So good morning, everyone. Good to see you. It's wonderful that this course can continue. Last week, we were looking at Tonglen through the perspective of our great, extraordinary, His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche, the course of his life from his biography. And we could see that Tonglen can be taught from the perspective of the ordinary person, gradually unfolding by looking at their mind. And it also can be taught from the perspective of the great Lama. So when Khenpo Munsel was giving Rinpoche instructions, he gave them also from the perspective of the Absolute. And today we're going to talk a lot about working with both perspectives, the perspective of where we are now, as well as the perspective of the absolute understanding of bodhicitta or ultimate bodhicitta. So I want to go over the instructions from Khenpo Munsel that His Eminence said were quite special for him to work with while he was in jail. The main practice I did in prison was Tonglen, giving and taking. Khenpo Munsel gave me many special oral instructions that were not in the text. In Tonglen, we generally say that we are sending happiness out to others and taking others' suffering in. But for the actual meaning of Tonglen, you have to understand the inseparability of self and others. So we normally start from the perspective of I am imagining a suffering being. I'm imagining my natural heart opening in the sense of altruism, thinking, if I could, I would take on that suffering, and then expanding it. We're doing it from the perspective of there being a self, there being an other, and there being something going out and coming in. But from this perspective, which is an entirely different perspective from the perspective of ultimate bodhicitta, we're understanding the inseparability of self and other. So he goes on to say, the ground of our minds is the same. We understand this from the view. So this starts to introduce how important the view is when we're practicing any of our meditation trainings. And we'll be going more into the view of Buddha nature today. In this context, even if there are many types of suffering, there really is only one thing called suffering. There is only one suffering. If there's only one suffering, that at this time, when you yourself have great suffering, you should think, the minds of the sentient beings of the three realms and my mind have the same ground. However, the essence of the suffering of sentient beings of the three realms and your own suffering is the same. If you see them as the same, if you see them as being non-dual, and then meditate on that suffering in the mind's natural state, that suffering goes away. At that moment, you have been able to lessen the suffering of all sentient beings of the three realms all at once. The Len of Tonglen means taking. First, take in this way, Tong means giving. If you understand mind's nature, then you recognize the essence of whatever suffering and afflictive emotions there may be to be emptiness. So we have the view of Buddha nature, non-dual between self and other, and now emptiness. When suffering does not harm you anymore, the mind has great bliss. If at that time you meditate, making self and others inseparable, then that bliss can diminish the self-grasping of all sentient beings. It can lessen that self-grasping. The happiness that is being given is the bliss that comes from the practice of giving and taking. This is how you should practice. So for practicing mixed with emptiness, bliss naturally arises, and that's what we're giving. The minds of the sentient beings of the three realms and my mind have the same ground. However, the essence of suffering of sentient beings of the three realms and your own suffering is the same. If you see them as the same, if you see them as being non-dual, and then meditate on that suffering, in the mind's natural state, the suffering goes away. At that moment, you have been able to lessen the suffering of all sentient beings of the three realms all at once. So this is taken from the biography that I was reading last week, the second volume, in which he talks about his practice of Tonglen in prison and the special instructions of Khenpo Munsel. And what's extraordinary about this, about these instructions and about the situation he was in, is he was able to see in the prison, in the example of one of the very great lamas who had realized emptiness, who had realized the non-dual nature of self and others, during the time of great sickness running through the prison, that lama was able to actually take on that suffering and lessen it for others. And so other beings in the prison got well, and that lama passed away. So normally we don't speak of things in Tonglen in terms of directly taking on the suffering of others. It's a mental training. But when we have a complete mastery over emptiness, then the great lamas have been able to work with it physically. And that's, of course, quite extraordinary. So we're going to look at ultimate bodhicitta today, and approach it in a fairly simple manner, approach Buddha nature in a fairly simple manner. So we can start to infuse our practice of Tonglen with the view of Buddha nature. And that really informs how we practice it. And it helps us understand that we are involved in a process of our mind unfolding. And while we're in that process, there are two perspectives, the perspective of the ultimate and the perspective of the relative. And it's a little like if we're standing outside and looking up, we see the sun. So we have the perspective of the person who's still in prison, or the person who's imprisoned by their disturbing emotions and belief in a separately existing self. And we look up at the sun. The perspective of the ultimate is more like the perspective of the sun looking down. From the perspective of the sun looking down, there isn't a sense of any kind of separation. There isn't a sense of any kind of differentiation. The sun just shines, and it shines everywhere, and it shines everywhere equally. And the process that we're involved with is sort of like the astronaut going from the Earth to the moon. So at each stage, the astronaut can see things from a slightly different perspective and understands the difference between the perspective from space and the perspective from down on the Earth. So that's what we're working with. So when we're practicing, we can see that for the most part, occasionally we still have disturbing emotions that arise. And we may intellectually understand that there is no separation between self and others. But in terms of the way we think and in terms of the way we act, especially in Tonglen, we can still see that a self-protective thought arises, and we still see others as others, especially when that self-protection thought arises. And that's why Tonglen is so helpful, because it helps us see how strong that feeling of separation is and how strong those boundaries are, and how to train in compassion to soften those boundaries. But we want to work with the view so that as we're softening the boundaries, we have a sense of how far we can go with it. And the purpose of working with those boundaries. So this is a quote from the Garland of Mahamudra practices. Through the view, meaning is established. So we understand that the goal is this non-dual understanding and this vast compassion that is undifferentiated and unceasing. Through the view, the meaning is established. Through meditation, the meaning is experienced. So as we're practicing Tonglen, occasionally we can just feel the boundaries drop. And for a minute, they might drop completely. So we have a sense of a brief experience of the meaning of the view. Through activities, the experience of the meaning is enhanced. So we might have a slight understanding in meditation, and then when we go act off the cushion, we start to see, oh, I can see I'm still behaving as though there's a boundary. So the activities off the cushion enhance that experience that we had on the cushion, right? So this is why study, contemplation or reflection, meditation, and then meditation in action, they're all important parts. And particularly today, we can see the importance of study because we have to firmly establish the view. For many, the experience in training and compassion is really attractive, and we really feel its benefit, and we feel the deep effect it has on our heart. And sometimes we can think, oh, I don't have to study emptiness. That's not as important. That's logical and academic. But from this perspective, we see in order to really fully understand bodhicitta, to fully open our hearts, we have to really understand emptiness. Until we understand emptiness, we won't have a non-dual understanding of self and other. So that's why it's crucial. And it's also crucial to understand our Buddha nature because it gives us such extraordinary confidence to do this work. So one of the texts I was reading this week was saying, what are the obstacles to our awakening? What are the most common obstacles to our awakening? And the most common obstacles are laziness and self-discouragement. And I think we all understand how pervasive self-discouragement is. I am not the ideal. I am not His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche. That is totally different. That kind of mind is so different from me. I am so clearly not that. I can't do it. You know, we start to do the practice of Tonglen and we get frightened with a little step and say, oh, I can't do it. I'm such a lesser kind of practitioner. Whereas the philosophy of Buddha nature talks about the equality of mind between our mind and that of all the Buddhas. And many, many times, Pema Chodron has taught that it's only to the degree that we can be compassionate towards ourselves, it's only to that degree that we can be compassionate towards others. And I found over and over the truth of that insightful statement. That it's only to the degree that we can face our own shadow and see the vulnerable, fragile nature of being human that we can really open to other beings. If we can see our own shadow and accept that, then we can accept the failings of others and be fully and authentically compassionate towards them. And so our process of introspection, self-acceptance, unfolding, and our Buddha nature are really so connected. It's it's both wonderful and encouraging and humbling to see that, particularly because our culture is so harsh. Our inner views of ourselves is so harsh and judgmental. So of all the teachings, Buddha nature is the most wonderful teaching to work with that self-hatred or harshness, guilt or shame that is so pervasive. So as we're working, as we're practicing, when we're working with the Tonglen and other practices, we see how there are lots of different qualities of skillful means that are exemplified in each of the practices. So as I was saying, that with Tonglen, we begin with a very firm belief in self and other that we can see, and we progress to the sameness of self and others. So you can see as you're practicing Tonglen quite regularly, you can start to see that you can, before you put others before yourself in an authentic way, you can put others as the same of yourself in an authentic way. And for right now, I think the virus is such an incredible teaching for that. We can see in terms of all of the people that we might have categorized sort of as neutral. We have our friends and family, we have people who are quite difficult for us, but there's a whole category of people that are sort of neutral. The postman, the delivery man, the folks in the grocery store. We don't know them, we don't have a personal connection with them, but at this moment, we can see with incredible gratitude that our hopes and dreams for our lives and their hopes and dreams for their lives are absolutely equal. And our happiness is totally dependent on their happiness. Our health is dependent on their health. So we're able to see in a much more direct way the equality of self and others, how dependent we are on a myriad number of beings, and that our joy, peace, and happiness is totally interconnected with theirs. And we can start to see the sameness of our lives and their lives, of our wish for health and joy in our family and our wish for health and joy in their family. So it's a great teaching. And then from the Vajrayana perspective, many of us have been practicing the Tara practice in our morning meditation. So you can see, oh, that's a different kind of skillful means. With the Tara practice, we're imagining ourselves in our perfected state. We're imagining our Buddha nature fully realized, and we're seeing all beings as Tara. We're seeing all sounds as the sounds of the Tara mantra. We're seeing the reality as her Pure Land. So it's more from the perspective of the sun looking down than for the perspective of the ground looking up. So from the state of that practice, we're imagining ourselves as fully accomplished and opening with the spaciousness and the wisdom of Tara's mind. So it's a different kind of skillful means that's rooted in a different perspective of the same view that we have in Buddhism of the relative and absolute being inseparable and two sides of the same hand, as Kenshin puts it. And then the third skillful means, establishing the view, we work with our minds to untangle our minds, particularly through the wonderful logic of Madhyamaka, or the logic in the chapters of Shantideva. So it's a way of looking at our beliefs and reasoning with those beliefs until we see through reasoning that there's no separation between self and others. And we'll go into that a little more next week. So when we look at Buddha nature, and we're looking what Khenpo Munsel was saying to Rinpoche about the ground of our mind being the same, and the sameness of both the suffering of our suffering and that of all beings. It has to do with understanding the ultimate. It has to do with understanding Dharmakaya and Buddha nature. So I'm going to read two verses, and these are two verses that are quoted all the time from the Uttara Tantra, and they're incredible verses to contemplate. The perfect Buddhakaya pervades all. Suchness cannot be differentiated, and all beings have the potential, thus they always have Buddha nature. Now I'm going to read another translation. Buddha essence is ever present in everyone because the Dharmakaya of perfect Buddhahood pervades all. The suchness is undifferentiated and they have the potential. So this is presenting the ultimate in the first two verses. Suchness cannot be differentiated and it pervades all. It's ever present, all pervasive, cannot be differentiated. So that perspective of the Dharmakaya, the ultimate, as being suchness or all there is, and completely pervasive, addresses the view that Khenpo Munsel was talking about when he was saying the ground is the same. So the ground of Dharmakaya, the pervasive nature of suchness, can't be differentiated. The pervasiveness in Rinpoche, in ourselves, in friends, enemies, and neutral beings is exactly the same. It can't be differentiated, and it is all pervasive. So that is the ground. And then within that, all of us beings have exactly the same potential, and we are growing with that potential dependent on our practice. So we have the potential, and that is unfolding at different rates of speed, dependent on our practice. But the potential is exactly the same in all minds, and the fully realized potential Dharmakaya is all pervasive. So as we're working on our minds and uncovering minute by minute a little bit of our own ignorance, when that ignorance is truly gone, that ground is more clear and it is benefiting all beings. So one of the things that I think is quite funny is they say, okay, it seems like a paradox. This is why it's hard to understand that there are two things that are true at the same time, that there is the fruition and the potential that's gradually unfolding. That our Buddha nature is at the same time pure and covered with defilements. And so again, we're looking at perspective. From the perspective of its essence, our Buddha nature is perfect, complete, and has always been there. From the perspective of our ignorance, there are wrong views and confusion, we can think of that as our disturbing emotions and our belief in self that are covering it. But those wrong views, that belief in the self, the disturbing emotions, don't ever in any way mix with the essence of the perfection of our Buddha nature, of the Dharmakaya aspect, the fruitional aspect of our Buddha nature. It's present and has always been there. So although there can't be one example that covers the complexity, traditionally there are three examples that each cover a part of the complexity. And I find these examples so helpful because they're so accessible. So the first example is a jewel. And so a jewel can be buried and it can be deep in the earth. But when it is taken from the earth, it is there and it's perfect. It is perfectly valuable. It has never been harmed by being buried, right? The second example is like the space, and that's one that I find so helpful, where we have such access to seeing the sky. So we can see the space and we can see all kinds of things traveling through the space, but the space itself is never harmed and never changed. The storm can go through, the space is still there, the space hasn't been changed or harmed by what passes through it, right? And then the third example is water. And this is a wonderful example from two perspectives. We can see muddy water. Many of us are working in our gardens right now, so you can see, if you put dirt in water and shake it, you can see that it's muddy. And then you can see when it sits that the silt just descends. So within the clear water, the impurities can be separated and the water is pure again. But the other quality of water is that it's moistening and it nurtures growth. So the aspect of our Buddha nature that is saturated by compassion is part of this example of the water that nurtures growth. And Pagmodrupa uses that in his example of bodhicitta like being a plant growing, and that loving kindness is like the sunlight on the plant, and compassion is like the water, and that between the two it blossoms, the full bodhicitta. So these three examples are tremendously helpful, and I contemplate them all the time, and I look at them all the time and try to find them all the time, just to begin to understand how it is that we can totally accept that we do have perfection within. And that's one of the things that's so difficult for us. It's so easy to see a teacher like His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche or the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh and say, that being is perfect. I can see their perfect love. I can see that they're wonderful, and I can see that I get angry. I can see that I get frightened. I can see that I get self-protected about my health and my comfort and my welfare. So I can see that I am different from Thich Nhat Hanh, Garchen Rinpoche, the Dalai Lama. So it must be that there's something wrong or that I'm bad. And what's interesting about the significance of this view is to hold that both are simultaneously there. And that's why we can rejoice that we, in our imperfections, are just in the unfolding process that releases the realization and the qualities of the perfection that have been there all along. So for this example, they use the sky again, and it's said that it's like on a cloudy day, we can't see the sun at all. So we're sitting there and we cannot see our sameness with a great teacher, right? Absolutely hidden to us. However, when the clouds go away, then we see the sun and we feel the warmth of the sun. The sun has always been there. The sun has not changed. It's only been the cloud covering that's different. So what I find really interesting and what I like to contemplate is not necessarily the difference between the great masters and where I see I am, but how it is we traverse our understanding from our limitations to the unfolding of the greater perspective. So as I've become more relaxed, it's that progression that I'm more curious about, as opposed to what I might have seen as my deficits or my great my great lacks of whatever. So I can't tell you how clearly I'm beginning to understand that this self-discouragement, as it was said in the text, is a limitation that it's important to work with, and that it is workable. So I'm going to read you another very important quote from the Uttara Tantra, probably the most quoted. Nothing whatsoever is to be removed. Not the slightest thing is to be added. Truth looking at truth, truth is seen. When seen, this is complete liberation. So we are not deficient in any kind of way. Our potential, not only is our potential there, but the full Buddhahood is there. When the ignorance is gone, that full Buddhahood is apparent and accessible. We just can't see it. So nothing whatsoever is to be removed from our essence. Yes, there is shedding of ignorance, but our essence, the perfection of our essence, has always been the fullness of the sun. Nothing, the slightest, is to be added. We don't have to change into a different person. If you've ever been an attendant to a great person, or in a relationship with a really wonderful person, where someone else is consistently nice and you always notice that you're less nice, there's a sense of, well, I wish I was different. I wish I was the nicer one, as opposed to fully accepting that you actually are completely perfect. So it's incredible how our view of our deficiencies is obscuring our view of our own Buddha nature. Okay, so as we're talking about Buddha nature, and this is from the view of the later philosophy, and the Drikung Kagyu is from the later philosophic schools. We think of the relative and the absolute in terms of the Buddha nature as what's naturally present, that's which is in all beings, and the potential that is to be developed. So we have the naturally present, and the developing is the shedding of the clouds, the shedding of the silt, the shedding of the impurities. So the nature of mind, the sameness that he talked about in terms of the ground of all minds, has existed since beginningless time. And at the same time, like a plant that's growing, that's used as an example so often, is that supreme ability unfolding by means of study, contemplation, and meditation. So as our wisdom unfolds, and we've been talking about that, how it unfolds due to our study, contemplation and meditation in a beautifully natural way, it meets or uncovers what has been naturally present as an essence from beginningless time. And sometimes they talk about it with a beautiful example of the mother recognizing its child. So it's like water being poured into water, or a mother recognizing its child when truth sees truth, and that truth is liberation. So as we apply this view of looking at it from the perspective of the ultimate, and then we do the Tonglen practice itself, it's a way to then check in and see, where is it that I'm faltering when I'm practicing the Tonglen? Am I faltering when I flash on Buddha nature, or flash on that confidence? Is that first step really weak in me? Can I really develop that step through a little more study and a little more contemplation by looking at these examples of the sky and the jewel and the water, and just really contemplating them over and over till I have some confidence in that? Am I faltering with disturbing emotions arising? When I am doing Tonglen, do I start expanding the Tonglen and then seeing it bump up against an enemy? Well, that might be a time to use one of the skillful means of either reinforcing their potential, their Buddha nature is exactly the same as my potential and my Buddha nature, or it may be a time to apply the skillful means of logic. When we're doing our Tonglen and we're looking at our natural altruism arising in a situation that's close to us, and then we go to expand it, is it still, I can see that if it's my child that's suffering, I can immediately open up. But as soon as I try to expand it to someone I don't know, it's hard. So then is it a belief in self and a belief in me and mine? So how do we choose a skillful means that fits our personal understanding of our practice, and then apply that? So it's like prescribing yourself homework. You have to decide which homework is the best homework for you to take on right now by looking at, okay, I see that this is where my capacity to fully open stops or has trouble. And so I want to learn more about this aspect of the Dharma or that aspect of the Dharma. So in another description of the text, or the commentaries on Buddha nature, they were talking about 4 causes helping us see our Buddha nature. There are 4 causes. One is devotion, one is discriminating wisdom and prajna, one is concentration, and one is compassion. So it was very interesting to me that the devotion in this case wasn't devotion to a teacher. It wasn't devotion to a personality or an idealized being, a being that, let's say, we idealize. It was devotion to the Dharma. So it was saying one of the factors that helps us see our Buddha nature is by seeing that in our practice, some veil of ignorance is getting more translucent, more transparent, or dropping altogether, and then a joy arising, and thereby being able to see the truth of the Dharma and wanting to practice more. So it's by really rejoicing that we are practicing and rejoicing in each tiny incremental new understanding as really giving us evidence of the truth of the Dharma, and able to go a little further in our commitment to practice. Then the discriminating wisdom or prajna. So as we're shedding our not knowing, our ignorance, we're also developing a little wisdom to see the momentary non-dual quality that we might experience, or see the sameness of Buddha nature between ourselves and one of our very special teachers. The capacity to use the logic and see, oh, I can use my intelligence. I can use not only my great heart and great love, but I can also use the discriminating wisdom of my intelligence to look and see what's going on and to expand from that perspective. Concentration. So you can see how as we increase our capacity to concentrate, we increase our capacity to see subtle differences in our practice and to identify the more subtle barriers or the more subtle thoughts as they arise of, oh, I can see this is a subtle belief in self that's starting to rise now, which is causing me to shut down a little. So without concentration, our mind is scattered, moving around, and we don't see the subtle shifts of moving away from the practice and the subtle shifts that lead to understanding arising from the practice. And then the fourth cause is compassion. If we don't see that that we are interconnected with all sentient beings, and the purpose of all of this practice is so that we can benefit sentient beings, then we're not allowing that joy to arise to increase and enhance the practice. So when we were talking earlier about the view informs our practice, in our practice we experience the meaning of the view, and then benefiting beings, we enhance our experience of the meaning. We can imagine compassion radiating out subtly when we're on our cushions, and then when we're going through the grocery store, are we able to maintain that great widening compassion as we're passing real people? So our activities then enhance the meaning of the realization that we're starting to see on our cushions. So you can see how all of these things are interconnected. But if we can't accept our own Buddha nature, we're looking in the wrong place. Because all of this is happening. The practice is happening in our own heart mind. We're understanding the Dharma in our own heart mind. We're looking at how our actions begin, complete in our own heart mind. And if we think Buddhahood is somewhere else, somewhere outside of ourselves, some idealized someone that's different from ourselves, we are totally looking in the wrong place. And that's why this philosophical view of Buddha nature is so important. Because we have to be able to accept that this unfolding is happening inside, and this is where Buddhahood is to be found. So I was really moved this week by a reading from some journals of, I don't want to say an ordinary practitioner, she was a dedicated practitioner, but sometimes, particularly in Vajrayana, we are really focused on the great teachers. And we go to the great teachers and we listen to the great teachers with such openness, and we often don't listen as seriously to our fellow practitioners, our Sangha, for beings who are more like older sisters. And I think this is one of the reasons I'm so grateful to Pema Chodron. I can study with the Dalai Lama, I can study with His Holiness Chetsam Rinpoche, I can study with His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche, But for my own personal progress, I sometimes feel like, well, there are rungs missing on the ladder. They're describing this, but I'm still having trouble getting from here to there. And when I study with Pema Chodron, she's so open about her process. It's like she's adding the extra rungs on the ladder that help me get just the baby steps that I need. And so this reading just really broke my heart, because I think it exemplified for so many of us our feelings about ourselves and our own practice. And it was the journals of Bernie Glassman's wife. So he was the famous one who accomplished all of these incredible activities. He started the Order of Interbeing with our Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. Very prominent man, but he had his wife beside him, who was a very different kind of person and who wasn't famous. But after she died, her journals were made public, and the people who worked with Bernie Glassman's Sangha felt that she was an extraordinary mentor to them. And I don't think these are at all from the same year. I wasn't paying attention to the year when I was listening to this Dharma lecture. But her name was Sandra Jishu Anyo Holmes, and these are from her journals. And this is at the point where they were encouraging her to teach. So she'd been practiced a long time. Certainly she had tamed her mind to a great degree. But inside, I'm trying to keep a phantom of self alive. And the further I progress towards Jizo, the more precarious the existence of that self is. Maybe it has to be killed. I have to kill the idea that there could be such a thing as awakening for me. Everything just as it is, which is a very common saying in Zen, everything just as it is leaves me with just who I am, which has always been unacceptable. So doesn't that just express what we've been talking about in terms of self-discouragement? If we are thinking of the pervasiveness of the Dharmakaya, everything just as it is also perfection. If I accept that that's true, it leaves me with just who I am, which has always been unacceptable. Isn't that extraordinary for her to just say that so clearly? Life as it is leaves me just as I am, Jisoo just as she is. Then another excerpt, but I want results instead of process. What a trap. I want results. I want results. We all want results. What a trap. And then she says to herself, as I create and listen, I will be led. The process takes care of itself. Just listen. As I create and listen, I will be led. So she's talking from the perspective of being the one who puts the Dharma activities into life. They started a bakery for homeless people. They led street retreats. So she's working, doing all these fabulous Sangha activities. Many of us are working for our families. So as I create all of these activities in life, as I create and listen, I will be led. The process takes care of itself. It is so simple. It is life as it is. And if it is life as it is, then it must be me as I am. I don't have to add anything extra. I don't have to worry too much. I don't have to analyze and plan or think through all these things, although they have their place. As I create and listen, I will be led. I just have to listen. Just listen. I'm going to repeat that. It is so simple. It is life as it is. And if it's life as it is, then it must be me as I am. I don't have to add anything extra. I don't have to worry too much. I don't have to analyze and plan or think through all these things, although they have their place. As I create and listen, I will be led. I just have to listen, just listen. And then a few weeks before she died, in her journals, she wrote, "Only the wounded healer is able to heal. As long as we think the spiritual leaders need to be perfect, we live in poverty. I have a perfect teacher inside. There is no perfect teacher outside. Only the wounded healer is able to heal. As long as we think the spiritual leaders need to be perfect, we live in poverty. If we think we need to be perfect, we are living in poverty. I have a perfect teacher inside. There is no perfect teacher outside." And then from the perspective that we've been talking about in terms of the absolute and relative, I have a perfect, imperfect teacher. I found this whole sequence that was excerpted from her journals to be just quite beautiful. So let's just look at her natural unfolding. Where's the... "Everything just as it is leaves me just who I am, which has always been unacceptable." Her Buddha nature, her confidence in her Buddha nature is weak. We so often think that, just who I am, how could it be that? Because I have always viewed that as unacceptable. So when we look at it from the perspective of Buddha nature, the essence has always been perfect, and our clouds, our veils of dust are continuously getting more transparent, and we're shedding them with practice. And that's how the two views are held. So then you can start to say, life as it is leaves me just as I am, Jisoo just as she is, sort of tentatively, can I accept that? If enlightenment is to be found in daily life, in our own practice, can I accept that it has to do with just who I am, not anything added, not anything taken away? The process, she says, takes care of itself. And then she gets more confident. It must be me just as I am. And then I have a perfect teacher, and it's not someone outside. So here we see a really committed, sincere practitioner deeply going into her practice, and the progression of understanding her own Buddha nature, which goes to understanding that this is true of everyone, which allows us to break down those barriers of self and other, which helps us to understand that pervasive ground of Dharmakaya everywhere, that the ground of all mind is this Dharmakaya, this fulfilled Buddha nature. So let's go into the Tonglen practice now, through each of the stages, working with this perspective. So the fourth stage, brief flashing on Buddha nature. Second, breathing in something neutral, like the air is dense or sooty or cloudy or smoky. Breathing in and exhaling the antidote, the freshness, the clarity. The third stage, taking a situation that's close to you where your natural altruistic thought is, if only for a moment I would take this on, seeing what happens when you breathe it in, and when you exhale, your good health, your clear mind, whatever it is for you, giving away what you were protecting, that self. And then the fourth stage, expanding. And I'll ring 4 bells. Flashing on Buddha nature. Now, sending and taking breath, experiencing hot, dense, smoky, oily. Exhaling clarity, freshness, spaciousness. Working with the situation that's close to you. Now expanding that on the in-breath, seeing if the suffering of your beloved, your dear one, can be held in the same way of the suffering of others, of strangers, of beings in other countries and other realms. Taking that in on the in-breath to the degree of your capacity, and exhaling what you would keep. Sometimes we think of it as all of our resources, all of our health. The exhale, sending that. And allowing yourself to just see what arises in the moment, in the process for you today. I'm going to offer the bodhicitta prayer, and then we can have some time for questions. Bodhicitta, excellent and precious mind, where it is unborn, may it arise. Where it is born, may it not decline, but ever increase higher and higher.